You touch your ear right now, and there's probably metal there. A stud, a hoop, something you put on without thinking, bought from a store, mass-produced by a machine you'll never see. But 140,000 years ago, before metal existed, before anyone had ever smelted anything, humans were already doing this. Piercing shells, stringing them together, wearing them on their bodies. Jewelry isn't a modern luxury. It's one of the oldest things we've ever made. Older than agriculture, older than pottery, older than most things you'd assume came first. Modern jewelry is manufactured in factories, shipped across oceans, sold in glass cases under spotlights. But for the overwhelming majority of human history, every single piece was made by hand, one hole, one bead, 1 hour at a time. So how did people with nothing but stone tools and bare hands create the tradition that eventually became engagement rings, gold chains, and diamond earrings? The answer starts far earlier than almost anyone expects, and it's buried in caves most people have never heard of. Let's start with the oldest evidence we have. In Blombos Cave in Morocco, archaeologists recovered perforated sea snail shells dated to roughly 142,000 years ago, deliberately pierced and showing wear patterns consistent with being strung and worn against skin or clothing. That's tens of thousands of years before writing, before farming, before permanent settlements of any kind. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, researchers found similar shell beads dated to around 75,000 years ago, some stained with red ochre, a mineral pigment that had to be transported from elsewhere and deliberately applied. Here's the important part. These shells weren't functional. You couldn't eat them, hunt with them, or build anything from them. Someone spent hours drilling a hole through a hard surface, using nothing but a sharpened stone point just to wear it. That's not survival behavior. That's the earliest evidence of humans making something purely to mean something. Now some of you are thinking, sure, but shells are easy. What about actual craftsmanship, real design, real skill? Fair question, and the answer takes us forward about 30,000 years. Across Europe and Russia, archaeologists have found mammoth ivory carved into beads, pendants, and bracelets, some incorporating dozens of individually shaped pieces strung together in patterns. At the Sungir burial site in Russia, dated to around 34,000 years ago, 2 children were buried wearing an estimated 10,000 mammoth ivory beads between them, each bead requiring, by experimental archaeologists' estimates, roughly an hour of hand drilling to produce. That's tens of thousands of hours of labor invested in objects meant purely for the dead. Jewelry wasn't just decoration by this point. It was status. It was ritual. It was something valuable enough to bury with a child instead of pass down to the living. Here's what's fascinating. Once humans discovered metal, the entire craft transformed almost overnight, geologically speaking. Around 4000 BCE, in the region of modern-day Iran and Anatolia, humans began working copper, then bronze, hammering and casting it into rings, bracelets, and pins. By roughly 3000 BCE, Egyptian craftsmen were working gold pulled directly from the sands of the Nubian desert, a material so soft it could be hammered into impossibly thin sheets without cracking, and so resistant to tarnish that Egyptians associated it directly with the flesh of the gods. Archaeologists excavating predynastic Egyptian graves have recovered gold beads and amulets shaped like scarabs, animals, and symbols of protection, worn in life and buried with the dead to accompany them into the afterlife. Here's the key detail most people miss. Ancient jewelry making required an entire supply chain, thousands of years before the concept of trade routes was formalized. Lapislazuli, the deep blue stone found in Egyptian and Mesopotamian jewelry, came from a single mountain range in what is now Afghanistan, meaning every lapis bead in a pharaoh's tomb traveled over 4,000 kilometers by hand, by cart, by boat, passing through dozens of intermediaries before reaching a craftsman's workshop. Carnelian, a reddish stone popular across the ancient Near East, was heat-treated deliberately, buried in sand and baked over fire to deepen its color, a technique requiring generations of accumulated knowledge passed down through craft families, not written manuals. So, let's reconstruct a workshop. You're an apprentice jeweler in in ancient Mesopotamia, sometime around 2500 BCE. You sit cross-legged on packed earth, a small bow drill spinning between your palms, tipped with a sliver of flint harder than the bead you're working. The gold sheet in front of you was hammered by your master the day before, thin enough to bend with a fingernail, and your job today is patience, drilling one hole through one carnelian bead without cracking it, because a cracked bead means wasted material that traveled hundreds of kilometers to reach this room. Around you, other apprentices shape gold wire into tiny spirals, granulation work, fusing grains of gold smaller than sand onto a surface using nothing but heat and a steady hand. This will become part of a headdress buried, decades later, in the tomb of a queen, alongside gold ribbons, lapis beads, and carnelian. Work that took a lifetime of craftsmen to assemble for someone who will wear it exactly once, in death. Then, something changed. As metalworking spread and trade routes formalized across the Mediterranean, Middle East, and Asia, jewelry stopped being purely ritual or funerary and became currency, status, and portable wealth. Roman elites wore rings to seal documents and signal rank. Medieval European guilds restricted who could legally wear gold based on social class, turning jewelry into law-enforced hierarchy. And the biggest shift came far later, in 1919, when Belgian engineer Marcel Tolkowski mathematically calculated the ideal cut for a diamond, transforming stone cutting from an intuitive craft passed between masters into a precise, replicable formula. Within decades, industrial cutting machines and assembly line production replaced the individual craftsman entirely. What had taken an ancient apprentice years to learn became something a machine could replicate in seconds. You buy a necklace online, add it to a cart, and it arrives in a box 2 days later, cut by a machine that's never touched human skin. Your ancestors spent an hour drilling a single bead by hand, using a tool sharpened by someone they knew personally. You think of jewelry as an accessory, something to match an outfit. They thought of it as protection, as status, as something powerful enough to accompany a child into death. You've probably never wondered where the metal in your jewelry came from. They knew exactly which mountain, which trader, which months-long journey brought that stone to their hands. We traded meaning for convenience, generations of inherited skill for a factory line, and objects built to last a lifetime for things replaced within a season. The materials got shinier, the story behind them got lost,